Not too long ago on this channel, I took a look at a 2006 British horror thriller by the name of Wilderness, and that is a movie with some very strange similarities to this one, although it's far less known and, from what I've seen, far less respected and less loved. As an example, Dog Soldiers is a movie which you'll often hear quite a lot of love for. It has a 79%, for instance, on Rotten Tomatoes, compared to the frankly ridiculous 25% that Wilderness got. Now, of course, Rotten Tomatoes is not the be-all and end-all, it's just an aggregator site, but still, for having that many negative reviews, Wilderness is a much better film than that, with a lot of recognisable faces, and names who would go on to be even bigger and better since then. But although there's no strict connection between the two movies, it is surprising to me just how similar they feel, and it's beyond just being two British, wild-based horror thrillers. It's much more than that. The films themselves are actually not that similar in terms of the content, it's just certain story beats and certain similarities in the casting and in the look of the film and in the style, which are surprisingly reminiscent, almost as if there's some kind of weird anthology. You could quite easily have made that the case, although this one came out significantly earlier than Wilderness in 2002. Now, there was a planned sequel for this movie, Dog Soldiers 2, Fresh Meat, I believe it was supposed to be called, but that hasn't come to fruition, at least not yet, and given the fact that the original didn't make an insane amount of money, it probably won't be around anytime soon, if we're honest. And quite frankly, the fact that this movie, Dog Soldiers, did not make more money and is not talked about more often within the werewolf genre than it is currently, that's a crime, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm not a huge werewolf movie fan. I've seen a number of them, both more famous and less famous ones, including more famous ones like American Werewolf in London or Wolf with Jack Nicholson, and then some less obvious ones like Dog Soldiers or Ginger Snaps and a couple of others too. And overall, I'm not a massive fan of that kind of subgenre. I like the concept of a werewolf, but I just find that the films themselves usually fall pretty flat. They're very slow paced, usually with one or two key transformation scenes, and that's pretty much it. I don't find the story or the characters particularly compelling, which I think is why this one and Ginger Snaps are among my favourites of that kind of genre. And I can definitely say, at least as far as this review is concerned, that if you are not a huge werewolf movie fan, in a similar way to myself, but you would perhaps like to enjoy a good werewolf movie, I can definitely recommend this one. Because as far as I'm concerned, Dog Soldiers is a really strong example of how to do a werewolf movie well. Because, in a very reminiscent way of Aliens compared to the first movie, Alien, this has a very different approach to the werewolf lore and the werewolf issue when it comes to horror, because typically a werewolf story is used more as a character journey of one or two particular people, generally one person in particular, who gets scratched or bitten at some point in the story and then goes through this transformation. Initially it could seem cool, they're more confident, more outgoing, but then obviously it gets worse over time. They start to transform, become more aggressive, and it tends to have a negative effect on those around them, including loved ones. That's the way that most werewolf movies tend to break down, and as I said earlier, that's okay, but I'm not a huge fan of that. The difference here, on the other hand, is that just like with Wilderness, and this is where the similarities come into play, this involves a whole group of people, well-trained people in fact, soldiers, which of course ties into the name of the movie, who are in a scenario involving werewolves, but they're not just average Joes who happen to get scratched. These are trained killers who are going up against, well, other killers, but just not trained ones, more supernatural-esque or mutated kind of killers. That, to me, is immediately far more interesting than your average werewolf movie, because just like with Aliens, although I do prefer the first Alien movie over the second one, I can see why so many people do love Aliens, because it ups the stakes. There are more aliens, more people, and a lot more action, a lot more violence, a lot more bloodshed, and that is typically what you'd want from a horror, especially a horror/action thriller, and this one definitely airs more on that end of the spectrum. Now, of course, you know by this point that it involves werewolves, it's pretty obvious, and it involves soldiers as well. It is a British movie, and as I was saying, the similarities definitely continue between this and Wilderness, because although Wilderness is not a werewolf movie, it has a very similar kind of cast sheet, you could say, similar kinds of personality clashing against each other, but whereas in this movie you have a group of soldiers on a training exercise, In Wilderness, you have a group of young offenders going out on an exercise in team building under very similar circumstances from a prison, instead of being army. And another really interesting similarity is that on both occasions, both the team of soldiers in this movie and the team of miscreants, you could say, in Wilderness, are both being led by a character played by Sean Pertwee, which is kind of ironic that he's in both movies playing basically the same role. So that's kind of interesting how it has that sort of anthology vibe to me, like you could have almost connected the universe in a Cornetto trilogy, kind of not direct but connected sort of way, if you know what I mean. But as far as the plot itself goes, of course I don't spoil huge things, broad strokes about the story or smaller details, or at least I try not to, but the basic plot of this one is, as I alluded to just now, you've got a group of soldiers who are undergoing an exercise that they believe is just that, just training, but it turns out to be, in a very Predator-esque way, much more than that. It becomes a live test, if you will, rather than just a training exercise where they're not just fighting for the fun of it, having a laugh, all that kind of stuff, even though they shouldn't be doing that really. It should be a serious training exercise. It becomes very real, very quickly, and there is a ton of action, a ton of gore, a ton of blood, and quite a few pretty cool looking creatures, I have to say, in this movie. Usually, another issue that I have with werewolf movies is that you'll see a claw, or a face, or a patch of skin with hair sprouting from it on different intervals throughout a werewolf movie. This one doesn't do that. In fact, you actually don't get that many transformation scenes at all. You don't get all those cliched, people's faces stretching and teeth popping out and eyes turning different colours multiple times throughout the film. There's some of that, but nowhere near as much as the cliche would usually be. And the great thing about that is it allows the pacing of the film to be pretty much literally non-stop. Again, kind of like Aliens, when it really gets going, and like Predator as well, the pace just keeps going at 100 miles an hour, and it definitely does in this movie as well. So basically, as I said, they come across a werewolf issue, let's say, and these werewolves, just like they would in most movies, do not go down easily. So you can have plenty of bullets and knives and various other things that you could stab them or shoot them with, but they're not necessarily going to go down that easily, in a similar way to, you could say, zombies to some degree, but smarter and faster than that. And they end up kind of barricading themselves in a house. And that's basically the movie. It's like an Alamo-style standoff between these well-trained but completely out of their depth soldiers and werewolves. And that, to me, is a brilliant concept. It's a way to make the werewolf concept familiar but also unique. There are not many movies that have done it this way, and I think that this movie is all the better for it. The pacing is fast, the action is great, the gore is really good if you want that as well. It's not necessarily the goriest of maybe werewolf movies in general or horror movies in general, but it's got more than enough for most fans at least, and I loved it. I really, really enjoyed this movie. Now, as far as breaking down the individual scores for the film, even though I do love it, I'm not going to go ahead and claim that this is some kind of profound intellectual masterpiece of horror. Of course not. It's just a really, really good horror film. And I'm happy to be able to say that because, let's be honest, it's not that often that you can say that it's good in pretty much every way. So, as far as, first of all, the story and the plot, I'm going to give it a 7. And the reason why I'm giving it a 7 is because I think that the concept is inherently simple. Werewolf movies usually are, as I said, but what it does with that plot is a very unique, fresh, and definitely, as I've mentioned a couple of times, very, very fast-paced approach to what can sometimes seem like a cliched kind of subgenre within horror and thrillers and sometimes fantasy movies as well. So, although it's not a groundbreaking or mind-blowing story, it's more than good enough, and I would say it did a great job of working with werewolf lore and making it into a genuine action horror thriller. As far as the characters go, well, for that I'm actually going to rate it even higher with an 8 out of 10, because just like with Wilderness, the characters feel at the same time not quite as realistic as Wilderness. Those do seem very realistic compared to quite a few people that I've met around in England in various places. This one isn't quite as realistic. Some of them are a little bit too jokey and a little bit too confident for the situation, but still, they're very enjoyable. And if you think back again to Aliens, a lot of those characters, such as Bill Paxton, they're kind of over the top there as well, but it works because that's the kind of tone that it's going for. Likewise here, the movie is much more over the top compared to something like Wilderness, but it's all the better for it. It totally works with that tone, it suits the style of the movie, the breakneck speed again, it works. Across the board, I think all the characters are interesting, the good ones, the bad ones, the maybe somewhere in between grey area characters. The characters of the werewolves aren't just mindless shredding machines, they are smart, they work together, and again, that's an interesting twist, kind of like what 28 Days Later did to zombies, making them fast, and something of a game changer, you could quite justifiably say, for the werewolf genre. So overall, it's an easy 8 as far as I'm concerned. As far as the visuals, the effects, well again, I'm going to give it a very easy 8, and I considered maybe giving it a 9. Ultimately, I was a little bit held back from the overall look of the film. It does look a little bit dated. It's 2002, as I said, but it could easily be like 1996 kind of visuals, so it doesn't hold up super well as far as the camera work and the camera quality, for me at least, but the effects are good, the gore is fantastic, the visuals in general, the location, it's definitely great. The werewolves actually look good and are shown a lot. You get full body views of the werewolves, which is a very rare thing in werewolf movies. It tends to be from the torso up, or just the head, or as I said earlier, a claw here, or a patch of skin, or a spine sticking out somewhere over here or over there. This one just goes ahead and shows them. Pretty well lit as well, so they're pretty cool looking creatures. As far as the soundtrack, the effects, the audio, well for that I'm going to give it a more modest 6 out of 10 because it was definitely above par, which is why I'm giving it a 6 instead of an average 5, but at the same time, not mind-blowing. I liked the music, I liked the soundtrack, the sound effects were good enough, nothing that really stood out and grabbed me, but again, the tone of the film, it's not really going for creepy, it's going for all-out action horror. So it's not really trying to get under your skin in the way that something like The Babadook would, for instance. So I'm not going to give it a super high score in that regard, because it's not that kind of film. And as far as the rewatchability goes, well this one could easily change for me, because this is the sort of movie where the more I talk about it, the more I feel like watching it again. And that's a really good sign, because if you have a horror movie like that, it's got a pretty good chance of being a really, really good group watch. Especially when it's one like this, because in a similar way, Predator and Aliens, that of course I've mentioned multiple times, they are excellent for group rewatchability. They are quotable, they've got tons of action, great effects, great set pieces, and they fly by. This one does as well. I'm not going to say it's as good as Predator or as Aliens, of course, it's definitely not that good, but it's good. For sure, as far as I'm concerned, so I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. I feel that it's the kind of movie that could sometimes bump up to an 8 for me, but being more realistic and a little bit more restrained about it, I think a 7 out of 10 is pretty much where it would fall for me. I think I would be much more inclined to rewatch this with other people, especially a group, than I would on my own. But overall, that's still a very respectable score, and that means that with all 5 categories put together, I'm giving Dog Soldiers a very respectable 3.6 out of 5, which might not sound amazingly good, but that actually is very good for a horror film. And if you compare that to a number of other horror films that I've talked about on the channel, you'll see that's a good score. Many of the movies that I absolutely love in the horror genre tend to be in the 3.6 to 4 region, so that's pretty high praise as far as I'm concerned, and if it wasn't already obvious, you should check this one out. I can highly recommend this one if you are a werewolf fan. Chances are you've probably seen it. If you're a werewolf fan and you haven't, get on it right now, it's definitely worth seeking out. And if you're not a werewolf fan, as I said I'm not in particular, it's great. Easily one of the best examples of the genre. As I said, it's up there with something like Ginger Snaps for me, for instance. And that's it for this pick overall, so of course I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.